Hi, and welcome to another of MindMaxing Podcast series. And this series is Adolescence to Adulthood, the pathways, the journeys that people take, and how education is helping, or in some cases, hindering that journey or the pathway that people trudge. And I'm glad to be here with Will Patch, who's the Senior Enrollment Insight Leader for higher ed for a company called Niche. And Niche takes a look at that journey from, I'll call it, from the sidelines, and has a very broad perspective. And I got a chance to read some of Will's comments and some articles recently and thought, hey, this guy's got a really refreshing perspective on, I think, this very important topic. So I'm glad to have you here with us, Will. And I'll start off with sort of a first question from your standpoint: adolescence, whenever that is, to adulthood, which I've heard is now potentially in the 30s, but it's different for everyone. What are some of your thoughts about how education is supporting these many pathways that people are taking?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. As someone who is firmly planted in adulthood now, and I think it is interesting to see how it keeps evolving. And I think the past 2 years have changed what it means as well. Some of the things I think they're working, the one I'm excited about is that fewer students are taking standardized tests. And so that's easing that transition. I think that before it was always seen as these are a barrier. This is a stress point. I mean, think about how many of these 90s teen movies did you see where they were stressing about their SAT or ACT and, am I going to get into X college? Or, seeing that stress point going away is a win, because it was really just a barrier. It was there to be a roadblock. That's definitely a win to students having, now we're seeing more and more students opting not to take it, or even if they have taken it, say they're not submitting it to colleges. That's a refreshing proof point. Anything we can do to remove stress, to remove barriers, I think that's an absolute win. The one that I think is really helpful, just looking at, my college search back in the day to what students are seeing now, is just this wealth of information. They have more access to everything online through apps. This college search has moved online for students. They're not picking up, I used to have the stack of college guides you could get at Barnes and Noble, and you'd flip through and look at the different programs I'm interested in. And this program, okay, what colleges have that? I remember doing that, and that doesn't happen anymore because you can have up-to-date information from multiple perspectives at your fingertips. So being able to, whether that's through Niche, through social media, through just going on to do different virtual tours and events, you can very easily take a sampling of hundreds of colleges. I think there's a little bit of a risk there that you can have that analysis paralysis, of course, but being able to kind of filter down to what matters to the student and making it relevant, I think, is what's incredibly powerful. As someone who used to work at a small private college in rural Indiana, being able to easily and instantly reach students around the world is wildly different than when I was looking at colleges, definitely from when my parents were looking at colleges. They both went to Manchester because it was local and they knew the name and they could get there. I don't think it was ever in their mind that going to college across the country was an option. I don't know how they would have even learned about that back in the 70s and 60s. So I think those are big wins.
Yep. Yep.
Another one that I think is exciting, what's really working well, is putting the community back in community colleges and these expanding bachelor's programs opportunities. That I think is really exciting. It's opening up more pathways. I think there has been a perception of a community college being lesser or, what have you. Well, no, it's a college in the community, is of the place. So having this expanded opportunity where a student can not just get their 2-year, but they can get their 4-year while dealing with everything else in their life. You don't have to move away. You don't have to do all these other things. If I can just go down the street and part-time take classes and work towards my bachelor's degree, that's awesome. And so often these bachelor's programs at community colleges are very affordable. There's now over 100 of them, according to the new, I was looking at a data set from New America. I think it was something like 130 bachelor's programs at community colleges. That's an incredible opportunity for students.
I think that's really interesting in terms of the wealth of info. Having had a student, a child of ours, go on to college during this pandemic,
Yeah.
and needing to do tours when you couldn't actually go on campus.
Yeah.
So that wasn't even possible the last 2 years. So she, toured without touring.
Yeah.
And I think that access is really neat. There's a whole new way to access and understand a school. I don't know how accurate it is in terms of life on campus, but nonetheless, it's much greater visibility.
Yeah. Were you able
So
to really get the feel for it? What was that experience
no,
like on your end? Yeah.
it wasn't great. So it was, fortunately, because of my background, I had insight into what was behind certain doors, so to speak,
Mhm.
figurative and literal. But yeah, I think it really puts a lot of pressure on a school around their web presence and how they represent themselves to the
Yeah.
world digitally. I think it ramps up that pressure. But
Yeah.
on that wealth of info, which I think brings up a really good point. I have that Cheesecake Factory, the paralysis you were talking about.
Yep.
There's
The novel
so
menu.
much. Yeah, there's so much information out there. And I know from an instructional design principle back from my work in the 90s that, keeping the choices manageable or limited can be really helpful to reduce anxiety or to reduce, friction as someone's, like you said, paralysis. So the filters or enabling people to search, why don't you talk a little bit about niche and what you guys do at niche? I think that would be
Yeah.
helpful to give some framework there.
Yeah, thanks. So Niche's goal is to make the college search easy, transparent, and free. So being able to look at any school and get the information format in the same way, with the filters, the students go in and they are looking by program. They're looking for, I'm interested in this sort of net cost range. I'm interested in these types of student bodies. I'm interested in, we have filters for HBCUs, for Hispanic serving institutions, HSIs. I'm interested in, you can really filter it down and get very customized lists. We also have then the student portal. So when a student creates a profile, they can provide information, and then there'll be this list of here's colleges that match what you say matters to you, and get that sort of, for students who want to really discover what's out there. There's all sorts of students who come to the site. They're the ones who are really wide open. I want to see every possibility that matches what I'm looking for. You have the ones who are just looking at a few options. They want a place to easily keep track of their progress and read reviews, because we do have tens of millions of student reviews on there as well. So they can see, okay, what's the experience like and how do I compare? I'm looking at University of Michigan and Michigan State. I want to compare side by side everything about these two and figure out, what's going to be a good fit for me based on what matters. So we're coming and doing those types of searches. They're looking for scholarships that match as well, trying to get that full picture. Ultimately, this is going to be that framework for where do I decide to apply? Where do I want to do virtual visits? Where do I want to do in-person visits? And then ultimately, where do we wind up enrolling?
Yep. So back to that very complex branching that can go on because there's so many different pathways now. There are so many choices, and community colleges is one example of that. The thought of community colleges offering the bachelor's was, kind of unheard of when they were founded in the 60s. It was really meant to give people this incremental credential to honor that they've done some significant work, and it's worth a credential. And I think we're in a new stage with micro credentials now of maybe even making smaller and smaller units of recognition of people's work that they've done. You had an interesting LinkedIn post the other day that made me crack up, which is around email marketing being dead. I remember in 2010 when HubSpot came out with their big promotion that email marketing is dead.
Yep. And we're a couple
and I
years past
laughed.
that now.
I laughed then because email marketing is a huge part of what MindMax does, and we went following their big PR campaign and advertising campaign. We went out and did a lot of surveying of students and prospective students, and said, what's your preferred form of getting information? And by far the majority was email.
Yeah.
Can you talk about both email, but more importantly, just channels for communication? How does a 16-year-old, how does an 18-year-old, how does a parent, or how does a 20-something adult get information now? Or what do you think are the pathways for them to learn about things? What do you think works?
Yeah. Students over and over say that they want email. I mean, and that's the thing that I keep hearing from people saying, oh, email doesn't work because they aren't responding. Well, look at your emails then, right? If I send an email that just says apply today, why would the student have any reason to respond, right? You're not making a conversation. You're behaving like you have a loudspeaker standing on a corner, right? You're just going out and all of your message is a monologue. This is something I used to do a lot of presentations. I would love to bring up the idea of it's a dialogue, not a monologue. So when whether it's on social media, whether it's on email, whatever your channel, if you want to just present information, okay, you need to measure that success differently than if you actually want to have a conversation. But you can't say, okay, I'm going to basically go out here and broadcast information at people, and when they don't respond, well, obviously it's a failure, because you're measuring things differently than you're behaving. So with we had 93% of students say that they want colleges to use email. So if you're saying that email is dead and we're going to switch everything to texting, and by the way, texting was much, much lower down their list, that doesn't make sense to say, well, we're not going to give them what they want. Think about how you're doing your emails. Is it we want students to read the information and know about this deadline? Okay, then you're measuring open rates, right? Is it we want them to take an action? Okay, what's your conversion rate? What's your click to open rate? If it's we want to have a two-way conversation, then that email needs to be something that initiates that back and forth, or points them to scheduling a chat, scheduling a text, scheduling a phone call, so that you can have that two-way. But don't ask them to do one thing and don't write one way and then measure it a different and call it a failure. That boggles the mind. It comes down to relevance. You have to provide what they need to hear at the time and on the way they want to hear it. It's the right message, right channel, right time. If you're trying to go out and tell the prospect, so a student who hasn't engaged with you yet, to apply, I always refer to that as proposing on the first date, because you don't just walk up to someone who's never heard of you and tell them to take this high value action. You need to have that relationship. And whether that's sending them back to a landing page, or sending them some videos where they can learn more passively and then opt in, or whether that's encouraging them to have a two-way conversation, that's where you need to be looking at building that value. You need to be able to have a conversation and really initiate and then measure your success based on what you're trying to do in that email or in that print piece or whatever.
Communication, right.
Yeah.
There's lots of avenues to communicate. There's lots of avenues for students to get access to information. What are some of the things that are not working, or some of the things that are hindering success, as either from a persistence standpoint, from an access standpoint, or from finding a right fit standpoint?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of sort of the access things, whether that's perceptions of, I don't think I'll make it. I don't think that I can afford it. Those sorts of things. There's the barriers, things like the standardized tests that are just standing in the way. Those are things that we can do a little about, I think with the student confidence and things like that, that's harder to get at unless you're really working on it with community-based organizations, with the high schools themselves, to really help students see themselves there. Because if you have, there's great programs where colleges bring students in and help them see themselves on campus and see that they can do it. But for a student to opt in to take that, there has to be some degree of, I can already kind of see myself there, right? For a student to opt in and go to that type of event, if they're already saying, oh, I'll never make it, why would they opt in to go to that event? So getting to them earlier, I think, is a big thing there. I think in terms of perception, the biggest stressor and the biggest lack of confidence that we always see from students is in their ability to afford college. That's something that there's been a big media push of how expensive college is and how unaffordable it is. And, you hear the numbers of 100,000 in debt, when in reality that's less than 1% of students, and most of them have doctorates. There's the reality versus the what gets the headlines. But if we live in a world where everyone's just reading the headlines, that's going to affect the student's confidence and perception, right? So when we ask students, are you, I think good marker here is, are you eliminating colleges from consideration based on the sticker price? You can't tell a student how affordable you can't tell a student how affordable you are if they aren't even going to apply to you because they think that they can't afford it in the first place. I use the example probably too often of, if I go into a burger place and it says $5 on the menu, I'm making a decision whether or not that's worth it to me, right? I wouldn't expect to order it and then pay $2. The price you see for pretty much everything else is the price you pay. And college is priced so differently, and it's the first major buying decision that a student makes. And I say that with my own hatred of the word buying decision, when in reality it's an investment. It's not a purchase, it's an investment in the future. You're not buying a diploma, you're spending money to get these experiences and really grow yourself. So the most recent data here with the class of 2022, 75% of seniors said they're eliminating colleges based on the total published cost for ever applying, ever considering it. 75%. 73% in 2021 did, 68 in 2020, 56 in 2019. That's a huge spike from 2019, 56 to 75% in 2022. And this week we're actually launching our survey of the class of 2023. So it'll be interesting to see what their take is. But, I think the pricing doesn't make sense. There was a time when there was that ooh la la prestige of, oh, this college is 60,000, so that must be a really good school. That has gone away. Students and parents are saying, no, we want outcomes. If it's priced too high, I'm not even going to consider it. If I'm priced at, $75,000 a year, there's only a small number of students who would even consider applying there. So is that the type of school you want to be, only catering to the wealthiest of wealthy? Or do you want to be able to do great things for great students, regardless of income? So that's a little bit of a soapbox there, but
no, but that's I think you you hit on some pretty important issues there. So I'm actually going to break it into three areas of the, one is the affordability or perceived affordability. Two is capability to actually do the work at the institution or get the degree.
Yeah.
And third is the, can I get in, the admissions?
Yeah.
So I thought your comment about the headlines was really important because I've been working in higher ed for as long as I have, and I'll go out socially and people will say, oh, it's so hard to get into school. I'm like, no, there's 250 or 500 schools at most that it's really, really hard to get into. Maybe 200. And then there's a school for everybody. And that's something that has changed. I mean, there is a school for everybody if they're willing to do the work. And they can have the time to be able to do the work. And then the affordability piece, I think, is fascinating. We deal with this all the time. And it is a buying decision. It truly is an investment, but at the same time, it's a buying decision. So we worked with a school where they were very committed to making the school accessible to people of all economic backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when they went through the information and registration process, after they had given their social security, after they had given their name and birth date, there was like an 80% abandonment on the registration process. And it was because the last page was there's a $50 application fee. And it was listed prior, but people don't always read that stuff at the beginning. And for many people, that $50, like you said about the burger joint, the $50 was a barrier. They didn't have the $50 available right then, or a credit card right then, or not knowing whether they'd get financial aid or not. That was a big enough of a barrier for them to say, yeah, I'm not willing to take that risk right now. And
I came from an institution with a free application. I always frame it as, why should you pay to see if you will be eligible to pay even more? That the idea of an application fee has never made sense to me. It's a barrier. It's there as a barrier.
And I say to the schools all the time, really, to cover your costs, like that's going to make a difference. So unless you are trying to filter out, I think we're in a different kind of situation now. Certain schools, the acceptance rates are below 20%. And those schools, an application fee isn't stopping people from applying. And then there's other schools that have a fairly open enrollment policy or approach. And so I'm not sure what the application fee, why would you put any barrier at all for someone you are absolutely likely to accept? Provided they get you with information. So I think these are some antiquated structures or vestiges of past that get things more difficult, make things more difficult for incoming students.
So really, most colleges admit most students, right? So it's not. And when we've asked our seniors in our senior survey, it was over 80% of students said they were accepted to their first choice. So this idea, I always think back to the 90s movies where it was always, for whatever reason, it was always this moment of, I got the acceptance letter. Did I get into my first choice? Well, you got 80-90% shot of getting in. So,
if you have a reasonable first choice, right?
Exactly. If you're a 2.0 student applying to Harvard, let's talk about expectations. But
right. The other is you brought up is sort of what I call the try before you buy. That not knowing if I can actually do the work, and I think that would be a very interesting. I think pushing, and I know certain state programs like Connecticut is doing this, and other states are doing this, where they're bringing, I'll call it college level work to the high school, so that students can have an experience, with a college level class different than APs. APs are also similar to that, but I think breaking some of those barriers between those very hard boundaries between college and high school, I think would be also helpful for people to get a sense of reality versus the very small headline, managed headlines that they potentially see. So do you see any opportunity for, or what opportunity do you see to bring, that try before you buy kind of thing, or get a sense of, or a better sense of what you're actually capable of doing?
Yeah. Well, here in Indiana, we have dual credit where students are taking college classes in high school. There's programs like that. It's still taught in your high school. It's taught by your high school teacher. So I think it's not quite the same thing. There's some really interesting summer programs, things like that. A couple problems there would be that, it's going to be whoever can afford to pay for that program. And it's going to be who doesn't have to work in the summer. So if I'm a low income student who's working all summer, working evenings to help make income for the family, I don't get that kind of opportunity. That's tough to reach a student like that. So whether that's, do we have some sort of joined program of, we have almost like a work study for high school students in the summer, where they can work a job and get a class at the community college, at the local regional public, or whatever. How do we make sure that the students who need the money can still get the experience and not feel like it's an either or? I'd love to see some of those types of programs. How do we make it flexible? How do we join them so that the schedule we know will work around the class?
Great. So looking forward, as we are heading into hopefully a post-pandemic world with obviously lots of tales of impact.
Mhm.
What are some things that you think you'd like to see, wishful thinking perhaps,
Yep.
or that you see on the horizon that would make it easier or help people's journey go smoother?
Yeah. I like the what ifs. I like the wishful thinking. There's a lot of things that I could dive into. I think one would be this decoupling of tying value to earnings potential. That I think drives students away from, like, right now where there's teacher shortages. Well, if we're tying everything to, this has high earnings potential. Okay, but high earnings potential doesn't always mean the best for society, right? If we don't have teachers, it doesn't matter that you're making $100,000 a year in this career. If you can't get teachers for your kids, if there's a disconnect there, and part of that comes down to, we need to value teachers in the same way we need to value nurses, we need to value social workers. There's a lot there that doesn't just come down to education, but things I hope that we can start getting into students' minds of, you need fulfilling work. You need something that is going to be valuable to you more than just a paycheck. I think we need more long-term thinking, focus on really education as career preparation, as lifelong learning, instead of just what can you earn right now. And we see this in fewer students choosing to go to college. When we go down the street and I see a sign outside Taco Bell for $17 an hour plus benefits, if I'm 17 and I see that, like, well, I could do that and make $17 an hour now, or I could go to college for 4 years and then get a job after. And I saw this article about 100,000 in debt, which we know wouldn't be true for that student anyway. But which am I going to take? It's the story. Around here we had a lot of factories close, and talking to the people who had worked there, who had said, yeah, straight out of high school, I was making a good living and I went straight there. And now that the factory's closed, I can't get another job because I'm not qualified for anything else. They were thinking short term rather than long term. Whether that's you're working at the factory and taking some classes as a just in case, or you're working at that Taco Bell and you're taking classes for a just in case, great. But putting all your eggs in one basket for short term, that worries me some. I think from there's, I think I really want to see these ideas of education coming with lifelong subscription then as well. So I've got my 4-year degree. How do I keep training? Whether that's as an alum, you get a couple classes a semester, or you get this or that. I think Cornell does some really interesting things with their webinar series and career education, where anyone can sign up and learn about different topics, and it really showcases their faculty expertise. And those are really interesting. I think that sort of in line with that, I've been trying to play in my head of what would remote or distributed education look like, because online doesn't work for a lot of people. Trying to find a way to get the same experience staring at a computer screen, you can learn a lot, but it's not the same as being in the classroom and having those interactions, right? uh, you know but a lot of times that face-to-face interaction is really tied to a place, so you have to go to that campus, you have to go to sometimes that means you have to move. What would it look like if there was a college with little to no physical presence, and the classes were taught in community centers and at the local high schools in the evening, at where the in-person experience was coming to the community, to That would be fascinating to me if that would work. How do we get the best of both worlds, where you can still have a job and you can take classes part-time and it doesn't have to be online. You can get that face-to-face interaction. You're interacting in a different way. I mean, we've done enough virtual meetings. That staring at the grid of people is not the same as sitting in the same room. So how do we do both? How do we make both work? And so that's something that's just been playing in my head. And I've got these pictures of buses doing like coding camps in the community. And I've got, it's fascinating to kind of play these games in your head. Another thing
I think a lot of that has, that it was the University of Phoenix model at the early 2000s. That was what they did. They brought, I'll call it campus to a local place. And then I'm familiar with a lot of state schools, big state schools, bring things, especially land grant schools. They bring things to, the local town like you're talking about, and they have either satellite campuses but I like the idea of the nimbleness, the Uber, or Lyft model, where you rent a space and or pop-up stores might be a better example, where you're bringing something locally, very locally, or from a time standpoint, like something that's relevant. Take your factory example, that if a factory is closing, that you bring something over the next year to that community, because you just had this huge number of people now needing to do retraining or development. So workforce initiatives come to mind as well. So
and we've gotten away from so much of that, and everyone just wants to launch online programs. Well, that doesn't work for everybody, right? You have to have fast internet connection. You have to have a lack of distractions. I've got 2 little kids. There's always distractions. So how do you get back to that? We always keep chasing what's new, and sometimes we forget about what's worked, and can we keep improving on that? I think another exciting shift is there's this interesting shift in student preferences towards the arts, and using that as an opportunity for a recruiting tool. And I think of it as, how do we really use it to help feed the spirit? How do we show kids that, you don't have to be an art major to just enjoy creating, whether that's creating a podcast, creating music, creating physical art, creating digital art, singing, playing an instrument. How do we bring that back? There's been a shift when we've been surveying students over the past year and a half or so, where now arts and cultural experiences are the 3rd most desired experience when they're looking at colleges. That's 25% of students say that it is a must, and 66% say they want it. Comparing that, 46% say they want the athletic fan experience, and 36% say they want to be a student athlete. Well, how many full-time arts recruiters do you see at schools versus athletic recruiters? How much coverage is there for the arts versus athletics? There's a shift in what students want. They want this creative expression. Are colleges going to be jumping on that? Are they going to be hiring recruiters to talk about, you can be a chemistry major, but you can also be involved in theater. You can also be involved in learning to paint. How do we do more than just do the topical interest? How do we also feed that creative side that everyone inherently has? Whether they're able to express it or not is a different thing, but how do we let them do that?
It's probably because all our programs were cut in high school.
Well, there's that, or you have to choose, am I going to do the STEM that I'm being told to do, or you have to do art? It's one or the other.
I know the experience that our children had through high school was the pressure to do college curriculum, which didn't leave any room for hardly any other kinds of choices. So I'd like to go back to one of your comments about tying value to earning potential. And I hear that you're an anti-capitalist, and and apparently weren't watching the Super Bowl ads or something like that. So, because apparently all success is measured in dollar value. But we know that
That's
that's
a
not
rabbit
true.
hole we can
It
open
doesn't,
up.
it doesn't, it won't, but it's more
Yeah.
than a rabbit hole. I mean, it truly is. As someone who taught, and I know you taught
Mhm.
as
Yep.
well, earlier in your career, and and I have to say it was and still is, when I do coaching and still teaching today, it's one of the most fulfilling things that I do.
Yeah.
Our kids don't necessarily listen to us, but
Yeah.
other people's kids do.
Yeah. But when
But
you're a parent, you're used to it already. So
right. So that tying value to earning potential, we have, the gainful employment, initiative and so forth. I mean, I think those things are valuable. And it's back to your headlines comment. It's also back to um, something that the for-profits figured out, that there was a path to getting federal subsidy
Mhm.
for tuition. And it wasn't that anyone did anything wrong. They took advantage of a very, substantial, I'll call it loophole. It wasn't
Mhm.
even a loophole. It was just a regulation. And
Yeah.
we're able to get, I heard in some cases over 84, cents on the dollar was a federally funded, uh, grant of some kind,
Yeah.
and or loans.
And if you want
And
to
then we had
expand and
the
you want to grow and you want to hire the best people, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? Right.
right, right. So I think tying value to earning potential. I think that's a big part of why we're doing this series, is to take a look at adolescence to adulthood, and what does adulthood mean? And so we got a chance to speak with Anthony Carnevale. He talked about
Mhm.
how in 1983 the age for financial adult independence was 25, and that was measured at $40,000 a year, and people could get financially independent, whether it was working at a factory and not going to college,
Mhm.
or going to college and getting a decent job that they could then start a family. Now, today, the age is 32,
Mhm.
and and colleges or some kind of post-secondary education is almost a requirement to get to that, except for a few different professions.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what is adulthood? I mean, our educational system was set up so people could participate in a democracy. So people
Mhm.
could, back in the early 1900s, feed the industrial age with people who could fit in the factories. But today
Mhm.
we have a different place. So um, I'd be interested in your, if we don't tie value to earning potential, and people are taking on these loans, and no, it's not 100,000, but
Mhm.
it's tens of thousands. Um, what are your thoughts about what is the value of education? What should education be doing? What is that vehicle enabling people to do, or should be enabling people to do?
I think it's, to me, the biggest goal of education should be training people who can be lifelong learners, to be inquisitive, to make an impact that is meaningful to them and meaningful to their community. Being able to be a teacher, be a doctor, start a business, what have you. All of these are things that can be really fulfilling and improve the community that they're in. And I think it comes down to being realistic too, because if I want to be a social worker, you know, I probably shouldn't be going to a school where I'm going to take on 20, 30,000 in loans, because I'm not going to be making very much as a social worker. It can be incredibly fulfilling. It can be incredibly necessary, but unfortunately the salary is just not there. So there's that realism too of, okay, well, there's a lot of colleges out there. What is it? The average now is like 26,000 in loans. That, okay, if I'm going to be on the lower end of that scale, earnings potential wise, let's look at some place where I'm going to be taking much less than that. And there's a lot of good options. Again, you have your community colleges with bachelor's degrees. If I can go get my social work there part-time while working and gain experience and graduate with no loans, or 5,000, 10,000 in loans, that's doable. If I'm going to say, well, I want to go to this out-of-state public where I'm paying 45,000 a year and I'm going to have to take 20,000 in loans as a social worker, that's a bad choice. Think about, what am I going to be able to do after? And don't choose your career based on that earnings potential, but consider your earnings potential when thinking about what sort of financial decision you're going to make, right? If I paid for college as I went, I wasn't going to be taking on loans because I had no credit. I didn't like the idea of having to borrow, so I worked a lot. I applied to a lot of scholarships. There's ways that it can still be done. Um, you know, but it has to be a good choice, a good conversation with the parents, with your admissions counselor, with your school counselor, and just being realistic. If I want to be an actuary, it doesn't really, if you take on a lot of loans, okay, that's something you'll be able to pay off pretty well. If you're going to be a pharmacist, you're going to be a physician, you don't have to think about as much as if you're a teacher, a social worker. There's a different process there.
Well, thank you so much, Will, and like to hear any closing comments or thoughts you have around these journeys from adolescence to adulthood. Any closing comments that you'd like to end with today?
I think a part of it has to come from think about, I'm going to keep harping on relevance all year, I think, but providing students and parents the information they need and really treating them as knowledgeable. I think part of helping students make that transition is speaking to them and teaching them along the way, rather than assuming they know nothing and you're just going to convince them to enroll. Being able to talk to them in a way that gives them the information they need at the right time, but also is teaching them about the process. Don't expect them to come in knowing everything, but don't expect them to know nothing either. Make your outreach educational and engaging and relevant.
Well, thank you very much, Will. And this has been another MindMaxing podcast series with Will Patch from Niche. And we appreciate your time, Will, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lee.